Deus, o salutaris nostra, Domini ex Deus, Deus, ex Deus, Deus noster, Domini ex Deus, Angeli, Arcangeli, Apologetics, Laudam Deum, Domino Majestatis,
How's everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. It is Monday, March 10th. It is the Monday after the first Sunday in Lent. Remember, a lot of you guys have been telling me that your Lents are off to a bad start. Many of you have had difficulties with habitual sin. Many of you feel as if your penances are not adequate during this holy season. But it's not over. Just like life, when it comes to the season of Lent, the season of Lent has an ebb and flow to it. Some days and some times are more penitential and less penitential due to our weakness. Sometimes we're not as focused as we should be. But until it's over, it's not over. So even if it's on Good Friday and you still feel at that time that you haven't adequately done penance, you haven't kept with the spirit of resignation and humility that is demanded by the season, even on Good Friday, you still have Good Friday and Holy Saturday to do penance. It's never too late. You shouldn't give up just because you've had a bad few days, a bad first week, or anything like that. But this is going to be a normal Q&A, a normal, ordinary, average Q&A. I will answer any questions that you want, and yeah, we can get to it. Okay, so there are no canonical penalties currently for pursuing bad books and media, but the moral force and principles of the index and our duty under divine law to protect our faith remain binding. Yes, this is true. There's a really good section in McHugh and Callan, their moral theology. If you look at, just find out how to look at stuff in the table of contents. I don't remember the exact chapter name or anything like that. But if you look at their section, I think it's in their tract on faith, when they talk about the prohibition of books, they talk about there are certain principles of divine and natural law that prohibit the reading of certain books. For example, and this is especially going to apply to social media. A lot of you guys, you are not very secure. It would be appropriate to say that you're not very secure in a lot of the things that you believe. A lot of times you may waver, and very easily you could be scandalized. And by scandalized, it means being caused to sin. You could be scandalized by some sort of material that, due to your lack of study or due to your lack of knowledge, may catch you off surprise. It may cause doubt, may even cause you to apostatize. So there is a need to, just like when it comes to not, looking at material that may cause you to sin in other violations of God's commandments. So also there needs to be a vigilance when it comes to not sinning against the faith. Okay. So you probably, and this is very safe to say as well, for a lot of you out there, you probably think that you are much stronger when it comes to failing against the faith that you are. We have the example of many different saints throughout the history of the church who have refused, many different pious and very learned saints who have refused to read the books of certain heretics, or who have made sure to be very, very, very careful about reading their books. For example, St. Robert Bellarmine, he was very careful about reading the books of the Protestants. But many of you, thinking that you are very strong, thinking that you are very secure in your faith, many of you go and very freely and without any sort of fear and trembling, you go and read the works of heretics without any sort of experience. And I've seen it time and time again. A lot of you guys apostatize by reading this material. and you are shaken by every single wind of doctrine. You become very unstable. You go from religion to religion without any sort of continuous acknowledgement of the faith. And it's very harmful. It's very dangerous for you to do that. So, yes, there still are principles of natural law and principles of divine law that restrict the reading of books. Okay, so here, did the schedule change? No, the schedule did not change. The schedule is the exact same, but in the United States, we have something called daylight savings time. So that's what happened. How do I send my questions to be answered? You do exactly what you did. Diamond Brothers' latest is a classic. Yeah, I saw that was quite controversial. I saw that was up, but I haven't checked out the entire video yet. Okay, here we go. How does the obligation to resolve moral ambiguity change or interact with the vice of scrupulosity, which can make one worry of sin if there is none? Well, when it comes to the objective standards of what constitutes a certain conscience, or what constitutes objectively good grounds for determining that a certain position can probably be held and therefore can safely be held. When it comes to those objective grounds out there in reality, obviously the laws are the exact same. When it comes to me, when it comes to St. Thomas Aquinas, when it comes to St. Alphonsus Liguori, when it comes to Pope Francis, when it comes to Joe Biden, every single person in the world, when it comes to considering their obligations, for those who don't know, you cannot act with an uncertain conscience, because he who loves danger will die in it. So let's say, for example, kind of a silly example, but I have this bottle of water right here, and I don't know right now whether drinking this bottle of water is sinful or not. I have an uncertain conscience about it. If I just go and I drink this bottle of water, having an uncertain conscience, I sin. If I don't know whether something is mortal or venial, it's mortal. So I sin if I drink this bottle of water. So what I need to do is I actually need to have some sort of certitude about my behavior before I engage in it, whether I'm offending God or not. Now, obviously, there's a lot of different things where it's pretty clear from very explicit and objective teachings of sacred scripture and of the magisterium of the church, from very clear and immediately drawn postulates of natural law. Like, obviously, it's not okay for me to steal $20. Obviously, it's not okay for me to murder somebody. Obviously, it's not okay for me to, I don't know, I'm thinking of different wrong things that I could do. Fornicate. It's obviously not wrong. It obviously is, sorry. It's obviously is wrong to do all of these things. Okay? So my conscience can be very certain that I'm not supposed to do these things. But there's a lot of things in the middle, and many of you have very delicate consciences and are going to worry about this. Unfortunately, many of you don't have delicate consciences and should worry a little bit more about this. But you need to be able to resolve that uncertain conscience. But as I said, there's a lot of things in the middle to where maybe you're not going to be able to have a super, super high degree of certitude. You're not going to be able to have that moral certitude that's required to act, right? So what do you do in these cases? Well, the answer that's traditionally given is basically you kind of need to begin to either look at authorities. It depends. I mean, if you're just somebody who is your average, normal, guy on the streets, maybe going and looking for authorities is going to involve, you have a trusted and learned and pious confessor, and you go to them. You can look at St. Alphonsus's his remedies for scrupulosity. This is basically what he says. This is going to apply for a sufficiently probable judgment on these points. Is you just go to a learned and pious confessor, you talk to them, and they are going to be able to give you a certain judgment that is trustworthy. And that should provide you with that degree of certitude when it comes to acting. that you have placed trust in God that He will not make His commands impossible, to where when you look for somebody who He has appointed over you and who is learned and pious, that they're not going to mislead you in this way. So they could be wrong. There's many cases in which they could be wrong, but obviously you're not going to be held culpable for the error that that confessor is going to make. But for other individuals, you're trying to discern a probable opinion on a certain point. Let's say it's you're a moralist or something, or you're a priest and you're trying to judge this point. It may go through looking at certain intrinsic arguments. It may go looking at certain authorities and what they say. And in many cases, you're going to have authorities and arguments on either side. So both sides of the affirmation and the negation, these are both going to be probable. And because of the principle that a insufficiently promulgated law does not bind, if you choose something which is probable, then it's something which is safe, because the law has not been sufficiently promulgated, and therefore you can't be held accountable for that law, even if objectively it has been promulgated. So I hope that makes sense. I don't know if that was the exact answer that you were looking for, but this is kind of moral decision 101 when it comes to forming a conscience in a controverted area. Heading in my seminary application tomorrow to the director of vocations. Pray for me. Oh, Keaton, how you doing, Keaton? Sons of St. Augustine. We love to hear it. I think I heard you say that you believed in the indefectibility of the church as an Anglican. How did you reconcile this with a need for the Reformation? I might be misremembering. So when it comes to Protestants, most of the classical forms of Protestantism, they are going to defend the indefectibility of the church. But you have to remember that by church, because they do believe in a visible church, okay? It's a common misconception that a lot of Catholics have, where they think, oh, Protestants, they only believe in an invisible church of the predestined, or the invisible church of etc. They don't believe in a visible church. They do believe in a visible church. But for them, the marks of a visible church are the preaching of the gospel and the due celebration of the sacraments. And some are going to add also the performance of church discipline, although that third one is more controversial and limited to certain groups. So these Protestants are going to say, well, the visible church might have become very diminished. It might have become very restricted in certain areas and certain groups, but there always was the proper preaching of the gospel and the due administration of the sacraments. Now, what do I think about that today? When it comes to the due administration of the sacraments, I really do not see how this could be held to be true by the Protestants. I could see the general arguments for them saying, oh, when it comes to this late medieval preacher or that late medieval preacher, like they were preaching something close enough to what I think to where I would say that is the preaching of the gospel. Like, okay, I could see them, although, there's difficulties with that, but I could see them arguing from that direction. But really, when it comes to the due administration of the sacraments, I don't know how they can both read the Roman canon of the Mass and concede that is the due administration of the sacraments within the Western Church. This is a very good question. Very good question. Lucas Hardy, he asks, in your video on the sacrifice of the Mass, you talked about how the Eucharist is immolated by a mystical separation of the body and blood. How does this work with communion in one kind? Okay, that's very good. So what I want you to think about right now is think about this question. If you go to Mass and you're hearing Mass and you unite all of your intentions, you unite all of your prayers to the sacrifice being made at the hands of the priest, right? We all should be doing this, but at least we're all obliged to do this during Mass. That's the whole purpose of a lot of the Mass. If not, we would just kind of have a little devotional circle beforehand to get us a little bit ready, kind of like we do before the sacrament of penance. That's how the sacrament of the Eucharist would work. We'd kind of sit around and we would, be obliged to do certain devotions to prepare ourselves to receive the sacrament worthily, but we wouldn't have all this, all of this other stuff. So think about it real quick. You're there. You've been praying and uniting your intentions to that sacrifice, et cetera, et cetera. So the up to the minute between the consecration of the Eucharist and the reception of the Eucharist in your mouth, between these 2 points, are you uniting yourself to the sacrifice? Has the sacrifice occurred? Now, the answer is yes, because the mystical immolation and the oblation to God happens not at the reception of the Eucharist, which that's when we receive the Eucharist sacramentally. Rather, the sacrifice happens at the dual consecration, because this, as I said, is mystical immolation. And immolation just means separation. So there's a separation, and we call it mystical because it's under certain symbols. So the symbols of bread and wine. And it's not merely symbolic, but also mystical, insofar as this is a symbolic separation where there's a real presence as well. That's why we use the word mystical. Okay? So asking the question about reception in one kind of misses the point and confuses the sacramental order with the sacrificial order. I hope that makes sense. I hope that's helpful. Every volume of the STS is available for order from the publisher on their website. Use their phone number. Don't overpay. Thank you, Agner. Okay. So follow this. If you want to buy a copy of the STS, then you can buy it on their website. Really. Let me look at this. And by STS, he means the Sacrae Theologiae Summa. If you don't know what the Sacrae Theologiae Summa is, then the Sacrae Theologiae Summa is, you can watch that video that I did, I don't know, like a week, 2 weeks ago, something like that, where I went over the Sacrae Theologiae Summa and why it's super important. The website is Keep the Faith. Okay, very interesting. $35 per volume, and you can buy it on their website. Okay, thank you for that. When we say justifies both remission of sins and infusion of grace, how would it not lead to a double formal cause? Okay, so I think what's most important is to remember that when we are talking about the remissio peccati, so we're talking about the remission of sins, we're actually talking about the removal of the stain of sin, what's called the macula culpae. The macula, that just means, like, remember, immaculate, without stain, the stainless virgin. So macula, that means stain, culpae, stain of guilt. So you commit a sin, commit a mortal sin, and there's a certain disorder of soul which orders us away from God and towards creatures. So remember how St. Augustine, he has this image of the threefold order: the order of mind to God, and the order of the body to the mind, right? And mortal sin, for him, we're at 3 different stages. You can either be a mortal sin, which means that the upper faculties are in submission to the lower, and you can be in that second stage, which is that actually your upper faculties are ordered towards God, but the lower wage against the higher, and the higher wage against the lower. The spirit lusts against the flesh, and the flesh lusts against the spirit, etc. And you have that third stage in glory, where we're finally perfected, and there's no disordered motion of concupiscence. So you have to remember is that when we're talking about the remission of sins, we're specifically talking about that disorder that occurs in that first stage, right? So sanctifying grace, remember what sanctifying grace is. Sanctifying grace is called an entitative habit. Entitative habit, this means that it's not like an operative habit. Operative habit is like you're good at writing. No, it is able to be a habitual disposition that orders your operation differently. An entitative habit is something which changes the entire way of being. So mortal sin, the macula culpae that we talk about being removed, This is a negative entitative habit. So it's an entitative habit that orders the entire self away from God as our last end. That's the effect of mortal sin. That's why mortal sin is so terrible, because it orders you away from God as your last end. But sanctifying grace is that participation in the divine nature and is an entitative habit that orders you towards God. Now, obviously, as you can see from those two definitions, they are opposing concepts. So when it comes to sanctifying grace is going to necessarily be completely incompatible with that stain of mortal sin. So we talk about the remissio peccati. The very presence of sanctifying grace obviously implies and is the very removal of that negative entitative habit, which is the stain of guilt that follows from mortal sin. Right? So I don't know why you would say that this would somehow require two formal causes. It's a single formal cause, the one as the terminus a quo, that is the macula culpae, and one is the terminus ad quem, so the terminus from which and the terminus to which, in this motion that we call justification. So I hope that makes sense. How do you defend St. Thomas's view on prostitution? Yeah, St. Thomas, when he talks about how prostitution is sinful and terrible. Yes. Why would I need to not defend that? Yeah, what's with only 18 likes? Ugh. Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's like I really hate when people like Trent Horn just praised Luther for not falling into the same error as Saint Thomas Aquinas on prostitution, his latest video. I mean, it's almost it feels like sometimes. I mean, I like Trent. Trent's a cool guy, but it feels like sometimes that there isn't an impulse of filial piety towards our authors. Okay, it very much feels like it. Like, for example, I happen to think that Reformed authors got predestination a lot more right than, let's say, Molina. But I don't think that it would be appropriate for me to go and to, even though Molina's not even like a doctor of the church or anything. Let's say Saint Robert Bellarmine. Okay, I think there were Reformed authors who got predestination better than Saint Robert Bellarmine. Okay, Saint Robert Bellarmine, great saint, doctor of the church, etc. But I wouldn't have the impulse, and I don't know how it would ever be appropriate for me to have the impulse to go out there and say, "Oh yeah, those reform people, they're awesome because they got it right, and Saint Robert Bellarmine got it wrong." I don't think I would ever feel the that it would be appropriate to do this. So that's on the one hand. And on the second hand, there's a certain requirement that follows from filial piety. And St. Thomas, he talks about this in the beginning of Contra Erroris Graecorum. And this is the position that the fathers hold with fathers before them, is that we should always be, and this is not even just an obligation towards our fathers, but this is an obligation towards a lot of people. We should always be willing, as an act of charity, to give a better reading of somebody else's words, the best reading of somebody else's words that we can, unless the context or the content demands some other reading. Okay? So when we read what St. Thomas and by extension St. Augustine say on this issue, all they are doing right there is they are drawing an analogy between the way in which civil rulers may permit certain evils. So civil rulers in certain times may permit the evil of prostitution, that fornication does not increase. That happens sometimes. That is a fact. Okay, so he's giving a analogy between that and the way in which God sometimes permits evils in the order of creation. So, how in the world and I've always been confused by this when I've read both St. Augustine and St. Thomas. How in the world do you read that and you come away with the conclusion that this is a precept? That St. Augustine and St. Thomas are saying this is the way that the civil order should work. Where do you come away with that? St. Thomas says, well, sometimes kings permit prostitution so that fornication does not increase. And in a similar way, God may permit certain evils that other evils do not increase. How do you read that and come away with, oh, St. Thomas thinks that civil rulers, that they should specifically promote prostitution in their realms, or that they specifically should in all cases permit it in their realms, or they should, in a case where it's been eradicated, legalize it in their realms. How do you come away with that conclusion? Any reader that's going to that page and attempting to carry out that duty of filial piety towards St. Thomas and towards St. Augustine aren't going to use, not only are they going to attempt that reconciliation, but they're also not going to use this as some sort of bone to throw to the Protestants to say some sort of kind thing about somebody that they hold dear, who we know is objectively evil. I have a very, very big problem with this. I have a huge problem with this, actually. As much respect and affection that I have towards Trent. Okay. I mean, could you have possibly asked some broader questions, Sud? How does one raise godly children in a degenerate world? It's very, very broad. Okay, when it is consecrated, there's a real separation between. Okay, when it is consecrated, there's a real separation between the body and blood. But by us uniting to the sacrifice, we receive his body and blood in the bread. Am I understanding correctly? No. You're not understanding correctly. Okay. Let me see if I can explain it better. So there's never a real separation after the crucifixion. There's not a real separation of the body and blood of Christ. Christ, after his resurrection, is immutable in his flesh, or impassible in his flesh. So after this point, there is no real separation of the body and blood. There's only sacramental separation, or as we described it, mystical separation in the twofold consecration. Because what is a sacrifice except, as Hebrews tells us, the shedding of blood? That is the separation of flesh from blood. So this does not happen really, as you said it. So like insofar as Christ is being cut and blood is flowing out. Rather, this happens sacramentically or mystically. Okay, that's what happens in this case. But your reception of the Eucharist, your reception is something independent from that objective fact of sacrifice. So you don't somehow make the sacrifice true by receiving the blood, I mean the body or the blood. Yes, there's concomitance as you described it. So concomitance means we receive the entire Christ. But this is a completely separate question of the question of when, where, and how the sacrifice happens. You can have a priest who does the double consecration. He dies, and everyone in the congregation dies as well. And the sacrifice happened, even while there was no sacramental communion. That makes sense. We say Jesus in his humanity worships the Father, but does he worship the Holy Spirit or even himself in his humanity? Yes, he does. Because you can't worship the persons of the Trinity separately from one another. You only worship them in union with one another. So you can't just like separate and give some sort of separate worship to the Father or some sort of separate worship to the Spirit. In the same way, we don't give separate worship like when we venerate the Sacred Heart. We don't give some sort of separate worship to the Sacred Heart as a distinct object from the entirety of the whole Christ, or rather just focusing on one distinct aspect. Let me see. What did Hudson say that you guys are talking about? What is the scope of biblical inerrancy? Can Holy Writ contain grammatical errors? As Dionysius of Alexandria suggested. The scope of biblical inerrancy, I mean, biblical inerrancy simply means that whatever is intended to be said is something which is true, something which is infallibly true. There are no errors in what is intended to be said. There, of course, could be grammatical errors. I don't know why this would even be controversial. There could be barbarisms or anything like that, depending on the way in which or style of which the author intended to communicate his words. This is necessary actually for certain genres of writing, like poetry. So I don't know why that would somehow invalidate biblical inerrancy. Can you explain the necessity of the real distinction between existence and essence? I'm reading Gardale's Metaphysics, and he vaguely implies it's mainly necessary for understanding angelic beings. Yeah, yeah, it's funny. So the reason I could give you two different answers. I could give you the boring answer, which is to answer the question of the necessity or the argument for the necessity of the distinction between existence and essence. I give you the boring answer, or I could give you the really cool answer, which is to talk about angels for like 2 minutes. Would you rather me give the boring answer, or would you rather give me the cool answer? Okay, I'm just gonna. So he's not responding right now, so I guess I will just give the cool answer because that's the answer I feel like giving. So when it comes to angels, angels are distinct from humans. So humans, we are rational animals. What does it mean to be rational? What does it mean to be animal? Well, rationality is somehow tied up with immateriality, right? You souls are something which are immaterial. They're able to abstract, and abstractions are not something which are somehow material. And then we're animal as well. Animal, we're some sort of sensitive body, body with senses. So this is why man, we have these two sort of distinct levels even within us. We have the animal level, which is sensory, and which is material, and we have the intellectual or rational level, which is immaterial. It's something which is abstractive. It's something which, with our body, we are likened to the rest of material creation, and with our souls, we are likened unto the angels and God. So we have these two different levels within us, right? So one of these, so the soul is what we call the form of man, and the body is what we call the matter of man, right? And what's interesting is that when it comes to the matter, at least the individuating characteristics that are implied in each one of us, these are things which are material. So, like, what differentiates this tree and that tree? It's the sort of material conditions right there. What differentiates this book and that book? It's the material conditions right there. So it's that very real distinction and that very composition of matter and form, which is going to distinguish all of us bodily creatures. Well, you may, if you are quite astute, you may notice something. The thing that you notice is that angels, how would an angel be distinguished, have this distinction between matter and form? Because angels are immaterial, right? So if angels are immaterial, they don't have this matter which differentiates all of the different individuals of the same species, right? So what you need to have with angels is you need to have this different distinction rather than the distinction of matter and form, you have the distinction, which also exists in creatures as well, but uniquely for angels to distinguish them. You have the distinction of existence and essence, right? So this is why when it comes to angels, each angel, the angels aren't like you have a species with multiple different individual angels, because they don't have those material individuating characteristics. Rather, each angel is a species of his own. So each angel is unique, just as man and fish and birds, etc., are unique in their species. So that's the cool answer when we're thinking about angels, and the less cool answer would be to give the demonstration, right? But I appreciate it. What are your thoughts on the Zeitoun apparitions? I don't really have many thoughts on it. I think they're real. There's not really much to say about it, because there wasn't really that many. There actually, not only was there not that many, there actually wasn't any reports or words which came from the mouth of the Blessed Virgin towards us. There's not really much to say. Okay, everyone said cool answer, so I'm glad I did the right one. Oh, what did I miss? So is it right to say that the object of love is goodness? True. And that goodness is wanting what God wants? True. And what God wants is knowable through natural law and revelation. Revelation, you mean Bible and tradition? True. I don't know what you want me to say about this. I appreciate the super chat, but I don't see anything entirely wrong with what you're saying here. This is very true. Okay. Although the ultimate end, there's various different proximate ends which are able to lead or order us to God, but the ultimate end is going to be God as considered in his own excellence and goodness. So that might be a slight modification to make. Okay, is a Pentecostal baptism valid if said correctly? If said correctly, saying is only one of the three things necessary for a valid sacrament. So you have the form of the sacrament, which are going to be those words which are pronounced, right? You're going to have the matter of the sacrament. So the matter of the sacrament is either remote. So the remote matter is the material thing, so like water. And the proximate matter is what you do to the thing. So, like pouring it on the person, sprinkling it, dunking them in the water. That's going to be the proximate matter. And then you're going to have the intention. So the intention is in the minister, them intending to do what the church does. So if you have a Pentecostal baptism and there's proper intention, there's proper matter, both remote and proximate, and there's proper form, which is the saying it correctly, then yes, it would be a valid baptism. But if you are going from the Pentecostal world to the Catholic world and you aren't entirely sure whether it's valid, then maybe you should talk to your priest about getting a conditional baptism, which can happen. Okay, so I've been binging. Oh, no. Okay, good. I thought you were going to bring something else up. Okay, good. Happy about this. I've been bringing Pope Benedict XVI and see a lot of similarity between your exegesis. You never use a strictly historical or textual critique. You start by presupposing the truth of Christianity. It's much appreciated. Yes, this is true. I think also that when it comes to the faithful, like if I was, for example, going and talking to a Protestant or somebody else, I may use a slightly different exegetical methodology. But if I'm talking to people who I generally understand as faithful Catholics, then I'm going to use the analogy of faith, which is going to help loads in being able to interpret the sacred text. I'm going to be able to, and that's going to help with not only exegesis, it's also going to help with those various different ascetical uses of sacred scripture. It's going to happen with those spiritual senses. It's going to happen. It's going to help with those applications that we make, which are different than the senses, but the applications that we make of the sacred text in theology or in other matters. So it's just so much more helpful when you're actually, talking to a Catholic audience and you're not having to do apologetics or whatever. Which is why apologetics is kind of boring. I really don't like apologetics. Apologetics is kind of one of those, for me, it's one of those necessary evils. There are heretics who are enemies of the faith. There are people out there who are unconverted. There are people in those states, people who need materials to help them with doubts that they're entertaining against the Catholic faith. There are all those things. These evils obviously need to be remedied. But I really wish that in a way we didn't have to deal with them. Obviously, we know that there's a certain incidental good that that acquires from the, as St. Augustine says, before the heretics started barking, we did not fully explain the doctrine of the Trinity. So when it comes to heretics arise and they help us sharpen and help us explain the teachings of the faith. But there are a lot more interesting things to talk about the Catholic faith, about sacred theology, than whatever debate you're having with some Orthodox guy on the internet or some Protestant on the internet. There's a lot more cool things to think about. There's a lot more cool things to read about. There's a lot more cool things to learn about. I'm very happy to be able to learn those things every day. I just wish that for a lot of you guys, that a lot of you guys would also discover how interesting a lot of those things can be, and not just be very attached to weird quibbles on the internet. Anyways, let me see. Want to play some Ghost Recon tonight? Oh, I have my friend over right now. We're going to be playing COD tonight. It's over. I would like to play. I wish I could play Ghost Recon tonight, though. Was Jesus' human nature created? Yes. How could it be uncreated? Okay. I don't want to answer any more questions about delayed ensoulment. Wagner, is Matthew 24:12-13 a proof text for loss of justice? The phrase, the charity of many shall grow cold, signifies the extinction of charity, since it would not be opposed with perseverance to the end. I would say yes, that this would disprove the doctrine, but I would offer you one helpful reflection for how I believe many would interpret this verse. So I believe, and this is just how stepping in the shoes of a Protestant who would be replying to you, many would read this verse and they would say, oh, by the charity of them growing cold, this is referring to a certain loss of charity. But they would actually concede, yes, a loss of charity is possible, but perhaps this charity is somehow a temporary loss of charity. So they go through the stages of having loss of charity, committing grave sin, but then repenting before the end. So I believe that's how it would be interpreted by many of them from a common experience. They would concede the possibility of a temporary loss. But yes, I do think that the text does support our teaching on this matter. No, I'm not familiar with the morality of investing stuff. Who is Aquinas? Why do you guys keep saying Aquinas? Say St. Thomas. Not answering any questions. Um, Khalid ibn al-Walid al-Mughira al-Maksumi. Hello. Inquiring about Catholicism, and I'm a slow boy. How do you explain Lumen Gentium, explaining that other faiths believe the same God as us? This is a roadblock for me. Okay, so when it comes to those statements have to be interpreted in light of Genesis 1, not Genesis 1, Vatican 1. Yeah, Vatican 1, not Genesis 1. Also Genesis 1, but Vatican 1. And then you could also think about texts like Romans 1 and the very many apologetic texts of the early church fathers. When it comes to the early church fathers, the critique they gave of false religions wasn't that, hey, you guys, well, I mean, some of them were so in darkness that they didn't even believe in God, which was creator of heaven and earth. But for the most part, when it came to these apologetic texts, you can read, for example, Athenagoras. When they're refuting the false religions, they're saying, hey, you are giving improper worship to God. Hey, you're giving worship to demons alongside worship to God. Hey, you're corrupting, you're saying all these wrong things about God, etc., etc. Okay? And in sacred scripture, it says, hey, you're guilty of sin because you knew the existence of God from creatures, yet you committed all of these gross idolatries and all of these sins against God, even though you knew him. So it would be very easy from all of these facts to deduce that if people are able to know God from creation and that people are able to offer worship to God, even while this worship is obviously somehow disordered, even while this worship is somehow merely natural and not based on divine revelation, they're able to offer this worship not of what we call idolatry in the technical sense, but of what we call superstition, which is not the worship of that which is not God, but the false worship of the true God. So Lumen Gentium is perfectly correct in saying when we look at Muslims, when we look at Jews, when we look at many other individuals who believe in God who creates heaven and earth and is the end of all things, these individuals, even while saying wrong things about God, even while they are giving certain amounts of incorrect worship towards God, but that when they are saying God, they are saying the same thing as we when we say God. Okay, this has been this is the immortal and Catholic teaching. This is something which has been taught for a very, very long time. This isn't something which is a novelty of Lumen Gentium or anything like that. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Oh my gosh. Okay, from now on, anybody who mentions Angel of the Lord in my chat, I'm muting you, okay? I'm tired. I've been asked like 20 times about the Angel of the Lord, and I've given you an answer every single time. There's more interesting things. Again, like I said earlier, there's more interesting things to read about than polemics with Muslims or polemics with Protestants or polemics with Orthodox. Much more interesting things to read about. Um, How to rebut the ressourcement characterization of the Baroque and Neo-Scholastics as lacking continuity with the earlier scholastics? Well, it's not really that hard to rebut. All you have to do is just read the Baroque and the Neo-Scholastics. I mean, when they gave the charges, the Neo-Scholastics were like, what? Like, what are you saying? You just read. I mean, some of the charges are just completely absurd. Some of them are just the historical work is just absolutely awful. But no, there's no continuity. There's no discontinuity. These guys spent their entire lives. Like think about how stupidly absurd. And Father Lagrange, he actually has a statement on back when Cardinal de Lubac was Father de Lubac. He actually has a statement on de Lubac and his arrogance with some of the claims that he made about other individuals who were holy, pious, and learned men. He's like, look, you're basically like, at that time he was like some 30-year-old guy. He's like, you're some like 35-year-old priest. These guys have been lecturing explicitly on the text of St. Thomas as professors for like 50 years. They've been lecturing. Like they open up the Summa in their classrooms and they lecture, they exegete the Summa throughout their entire lives. This is their job. This is what they do day after day. That's just what they do. And you have the arrogance, you have the audacity to come out here and say, "Oh, you have no continuity with St. Thomas." These guys took pledges of loyalty. These guys literally took, before they could teach, pledges of loyalty to the teaching of St. Thomas. Like John of St. Thomas, in his dying breaths, went before the Blessed Sacrament and pledged that he had not taught a word differently than St. Thomas throughout his entire life. And these new theologians in their business suits have the audacity to look back at these holy, pious, and learned theologians and to scoff at them. It's just absurd on the face of it. It's completely absurd on the face of it. And a lot of these times, these authors, the authors, like I will give credit a lot of times, and I have given credit a lot of times to the ressourcement theologians, because a lot of them were very learned. Some of them were quite pious. They had a lot of historical knowledge, sure. But the worst thing is the hubris of their students and their students' students. Because the students and the students' students of a lot of these individuals, they do not partake in a degree of the brilliance of their masters. So you have de Lubac writing something like Medieval Exegesis, where he's just combing through literally hundreds and hundreds of different authors, from just crazy works that he's just finding in the library of nowhere, and bringing to light and synthesizing it with all these other authors. So you could say what you want about de Lubac, and I might have said something which may seem a little bit harsh a few minutes ago about de Lubac, but at least de Lubac, he was a very bright historian. He was a very bright scholar, and he brought a lot forward that was quite useful. And this is why these guys get very frequently quoted, even in the preconciliar era. But their students are people who, don't even do the basics of Catholic reading. I mean, they don't even read the manuals, like, a Rahner or a de Lubac, or like a von Balthasar or somebody like that. These guys or Benedict XVI, you read through their works, and very clearly you look at the footnotes, you look at the endnotes, you look at all this. They're like reading very widely in the Baroque and in second and third scholasticism. Like they at least have interacted with these authors. But you look at their students, and these guys, like, they can't even read Latin. They just say the most disgusting, despicable things about the spiritual lives and the spiritual fruits of the works of previous ages of scholastics. A lot of these people are very uncharitable. They're very impious towards their forefathers. It's very despicable the way in which some of these people speak about previous generations. Like, yeah, they don't even read Latin, and occasionally they will just put forward the craziest, wildest notion. They make basic mistakes, even among the first scholastics, make very basic historical errors in assessing their positions. And really, like, I could excuse somebody 20, 30 years ago. Maybe they don't have access to this in the library. Maybe they're not able to get their hands on the work. But now it's like, it's not that hard. Like, if you want, let's say you're making a claim about St. Bonaventure. Like, I see this all the time. You'll see a lot of authors say, oh, St. Bonaventure thought you could prove the Trinity from natural reason. No, he didn't. Literally pick off the shelf, get his sentences commentary, look at Book 1, Distinction 3. Book 1, Distinction 3 is where all the medievals talk about natural knowability of the Trinity. St. Bonaventure, just like every other medieval, commented on whether we can know the Trinity from natural reason in Book 1, Distinction 3. And he says, No, you can't demonstrate it. That's what he says. And now we have the internet. So the internet, you're able to just go on, pull up the Carrecci edition, go to the page, read it, and say, oh yeah, okay, this is what I've confirmed. St. Bonaventure, he believed this, so I can, give a primary source footnote, and I can actually affirm that he said that. But a lot of these individuals, they're too lazy to actually even, or maybe they don't even know how to use the internet. They're too lazy to actually look to see whether these scholastics held to these positions. They don't have basic research skills to be able to look through them. So the students of the Nouvelle Theologie are extremely, at least from my experience, extremely unimpressive with their ability to research like their masters did, which even while I may have my disagreements with them, they're still respected individuals within the church for their historical scholarship, if not for other matters as well. Okay. But thank you for the question. I've heard some say that baptism with desire can apply to infants / unborn via the faith of the parents. Is this correct? Still a catechumen, by the way. Well, I'm very glad that you're a catechumen. That's very, very great to hear. So, when it comes to Venerable Pius XII, Venerable Pius XII taught in his address to midwives that the only ordinary means of baptism was the actual application of water baptism, the sacrament of baptism. Did I say the only ordinary means of baptism? I meant the only ordinary means of salvation is the actual application of water baptism. Okay. And you could look in the ITC document, so the International Theological Commission document. If you look in that document and you Control F, type in Pius XII or type in address to midwives, you will see that there is a recognition from the ITC document, even while that's not magisterially binding. So I technically could disagree with it based on intrinsic weight of arguments. But either way, when you look in, it's a good collection of resources, actually. When you look at what it says about Pius XII's address to midwives, and you look at what Pius XII himself said, he very clearly was excluding a long-term debate within the church that stretches back even to the time of the 16th century, such authors as Cajetan. Some authors even said that Cajetan's position was heretical. It's kind of a very severe judgment on them, a judgment on him, rather. And that part of his works was expunged in the edition done by St. Pius V. But my point is that this had been a long discussion of, can we, just as we do for adults, we have baptism of desire and baptism of blood for adults, can we apply these to children? The agreement was, well, we can apply baptism of blood to children because baptism of blood works quasi-sacramentally. Baptism of blood, infants can be martyrs. It doesn't require any act of the will in order to be a martyr. Therefore, infants apply to that. But baptism of desire, this is something which is excluded by the words of Venerable Pius XII. This is something which is excluded for a very good reason, because the reason that baptism of desire works because the dispositions in the soul, in the state of justification, when they have sanctifying grace, when they have faith formed by love, these dispositions and the desire to receive the sacraments is formally the same as the justification which is brought about in the soul by baptism. So the effect of baptism and the one who receives baptism's desire, they have the exact same state of soul in terms of their order towards God. So it is completely a theological abuse to say that you can have baptism of desire for another individual. It would be just as absurd to say, I can be baptized for another individual. Or it would be just as absurd to say, I can be justified for another individual. Or I can sin for another individual. It's something which is completely absurd. Okay? But yeah, TLDR, Cajetan was basically condemned for that opinion. I'm an undergrad theology student at Franciscan University, and pretty much all of my formation has been ressourcement. Where to start with manuals? Well, you can start with a manual that was Karl Rahner, Mr. Papist. You probably will find this very funny. Karl Rahner actually had a favorite manual. Karl Rahner was a huge fan of one of the manuals and said that anybody who wants to be a theologian needs to read this manual. And that is what I mentioned earlier, the STS, the Sacred Theologia Summa. Karl Rahner praised it very highly. You can buy the 8-volume version in English. Remember, it is you buy it from the Keep the Faith website, $35, keepthefaith.org/publications. It's something which is $35 per volume, and the one guy said that you can call them and you can get it. But yes, I would suggest starting with the Sacred Theologia Summa, because especially there's a very strong interaction with a lot of the tradition before them, and if you're willing to put in a little work and to take some time on it, especially if you are a student of theology and assuming that you want to make theology somehow your profession, you should get very familiar with these works. Hey, Wagner. I'm in OCIA in Athens, Georgia, and my priest is Father Gregory Tipton, who said he confirmed you. He says hello, small world. Yes, Father Gregory, he did confirm me. You'll have to ask Father Gregory about the confirmation slap that he gave me, because it was it was a heck of a slap for sure. But yes, I say hi to Father Gregory as well. He's an amazing priest. Okay, let me see. What does the baptism for the dead mean? Read St. Thomas's commentary on this. Okay, you're confusing this. So if sanctifying grace is just an effect of sanctification, what's the operation that creates the effect of sanctification? No. So sanctification, sanctificatio, what would that mean? Sanctus, okay, holy, factio, factus, making, somehow some reference to making. So sanctificatio, making holy. What makes you holy? Well, God makes you holy. What is the form inhering in us that is holiness? Okay, holiness at some sort of imitation of God, at some sort of moral purity. What would formally constitute holiness in the soul would be sanctifying grace. Okay, so sanctification, efficiently, God causes sanctification in the soul, and formally, what is sanctification in the soul? Sanctifying grace. Does that make sense? Why? Why? Why do you ask why? Mr. Since 33. Why did you ask why? What you guys are talking about grace like it's an effect. Grace has effects. It's not an effect itself. Of course. Okay. You're confusing so many things, DN. Anytime you try to critique Latin theology, you're confusing so many things. So one, you could read St. Augustine on this, on nature and grace. He distinguishes between the various senses of grace. But basically, when we use grace, grace can be in reference to something on the part of God, like God's grace, God's gracious disposition. Okay, but since God, in His intentions, is not merely drawn to something, but also causes what He wills. Right? He's not like us, just drawn to something. He causes what He wills. That gracious disposition implies an effect in the soul. Okay, and that effect in the soul is grace. So we talk about grace on the part of God, grace on the part of creatures. So grace as it is in God, grace is an effect in creatures. We talk about grace in both senses, right? Something which is and in English, we kind of have similar ways of speaking, because remember, grace, like gift, for example, could be gift is usually something we receive, but somebody can be gracious. Somebody gracious is somebody who gives gifts, right? Now imagine if you just call both of those grace, like it is in some other languages. Then you could say grace for both of them. And then grace, actually saying grace, why do we say grace? Well, saying grace is that third sense in which we use grace. Grace can also mean, like gratias. It's something which is a thanksgiving. So it's something which you return to the one who is gracious for the gift he has given you. And in Latin language, all three of these could just be referred to as the word grace. Right? So yes, grace is an effect, and grace also has effects. Why? So I'm wondering why he said why. Since 33 said why. Interesting. The Old Testament patriarchs were Catholic is obviously meant to be provocative, but in all seriousness, to what extent is that true? Okay, so read the Council of. This is very interesting. I'm about to drop some truth nukes on you. Okay, you're about to get some truth nukes dropped on you. So the Council of the Council of Florence, it says that since the beginning of the world, no man has been saved outside of faith in Jesus Christ. Now, faith in Jesus Christ is the Catholic faith, right? Okay? So the patriarchs, obviously, it says since the beginning of the world. It didn't say since the beginning of the preaching of the gospel, but since the beginning of the world, no man has been saved except with faith in Jesus Christ. So therefore, obviously, there was faith in Jesus Christ for all of the Old Testament saints. They had faith in Jesus Christ, right? So also, this is kind of an interesting argument that we could run against many of the individuals who attempt to discount the idea of implicit faith. Because very clearly, many of the Old Testament saints, they had implicit faith. They had implicit faith in our Lord Jesus Christ. Did not have explicit faith. Explicit faith, of course, is as I explained in that one article that I wrote, it is necessary by necessity of means, as St. Thomas teaches, as is taught it's magisterially taught. I'm trying to remember under which pope, though the Holy Office has a statement on this, that belief in the Trinity and Incarnation are necessary by necessity of means. Now, but as we know, necessity of means can be something which is either per se or per accident. So if you want to know more about that, you got to go to christianbwagner.com. You got to read that article that I wrote on implicit faith. Okay. But yes, the Old Testament patriarchs were Catholic because, as the Council of Florence teaches, since the beginning of the world, nobody has been saved except through faith in Jesus Christ. Oh, you were just joking. Okay. I thought you were trying, and then it just fell off. Didn't know. Hi, Jerome. How are you doing? Oh, you sent us. When we Dyer said the apophatic nature of the divine usia as opposed to the experimental nature of the inhypothesized energies, what did he mean? I'm gonna be honest. I don't know. I don't know. That's from the famous comment. Jerome, what is the comment again? What is that comment? It's like, yeah, I had to get. I'm pretty sure it was a joking. I'm 99% sure it was a joking comment. But Jay Dyer was like, yeah, I got to get blazed before I had to get blazed before I understood the apophatic nature of the divine usia as opposed to the experimental nature of the hypothesized energies. Yeah, he did say that one time. Okay, so I do have a question though. Why do some authors sometimes say sanctifying grace is the formal cause? Faith, hope, and love flow from grace, but not the same thing as sanctifying grace. Yes. So I am one of those authors. I am one of those authors who think that faith, hope, and charity are the formal cause of what formally constitutes justice. Okay. When we say that sanctifying grace is the formal cause of justification, we're not only talking about sanctifying grace as like an entitative habit. We're talking about that entire organism which is established by sanctifying grace. In the same way as, like the book of Acts talk about, I can't even remember how 70, I think it was like 70 souls came out of Egypt. Obviously, they didn't mean that 70 souls floated out of Egypt without any attachment to their bodies. They were just naming the whole by the formal part. So when it comes to sanctifying grace, we mean sanctifying grace insofar as the supernatural organism which is established by sanctifying grace, which includes its approximate effects of the virtues of faith, hope, charity, etc. So I think these formally constitute justice, and I guess my argument is relatively simple. It's from St. Thomas, but that justice includes the order of the faculties in the soul, and justification means the making just. So the terminus of this must also include not only the elevation of the nature of the soul, it must include the ordering of the faculties in right rectitude. So that's why I hold to that position. Okay, here it is. Yeah, man, I especially like to get really high and read the doctors of the church. It's best to try to do canonical studies when you're blitzed too. In fact, I had to get stoned off my butt before I finally grasped the apophatic nature of the divine usia, as opposed to the experimental nature of the unhypothesized energies. Serious theological study require a lot of weed. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was meant to be humorous. Okay. If rational animals, why most of humanity stupid? It's a really good point. Moral theology book after the CCC to continue I think that's supposed to mean education. Um Another good one. Davis. Get Father Davis moral theology. Okay. Father Davis. Why did I say David? Father Davis moral theology. Moral and pastoral theology. Okay. This is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful work. I'm a huge fan of it. So if you want to read that, that's a cool work. But I guess if I had to personally give you a little bit of, if you're asking about moral theology in the broad sense, then I would recommend something not technically on moral theology, it's on spiritual theology, but it might somehow relate to what you think is probably moral theology. Actually, you asked this before, and I said the CCC. So did you read the entirety of the CCC in the 1 week since you asked this last question? I don't know if I should give you this book. Hmm. I don't know. Okay, maybe I will. I will. Okay. Theology of Christian Perfection by Roya Marin. Jerome's crying right now, my Spanish pronunciation. Very grateful for your work. Every theology course I've taken has been here's what St. Thomas says, and then here's what Ratzinger Balthazar says, skipping over hundreds of years. Yeah, it is very annoying because, at least for me personally, I do genuinely like to have synthesis between a lot of different generations, right? Like I don't know why. For some reason, 20th century authors just thought that this like very I don't even know what to describe it. This very like cute. What is the word I would use for it? It's very silly. I'm just going to call it silly. This very silly way of going about theology. This like rhetorical flourish of everybody got it wrong for X number of years before me, from X to Y year. Like they'll literally say this. They'll say, "Oh, well, St. Thomas said this, and nobody understood it until me." That's generally how they will frame their own writing. Why in the world is it remotely convincing that you got something right that like 500 years of readers got wrong? Why would that be remotely convincing as like a rhetorical point when this is a point which is explicitly studied within the schools? Why? Why would that make sense? Other earlier authors, they don't make that claim. Like St. Thomas, he doesn't make that claim about his own works. He very much views his work as simply a synthesis of what has come before him. But yeah, I don't know why they think this is like if you came up and said to me, yeah, I thought about this new theological thing and everyone wrote about it for the last 700 years, but all of those people got it wrong, I probably wouldn't even waste the time to listen to you. I don't know why these authors think it's just a cool thing to say. If one is apostatized before over acts or statements or teachings of the popes, would it be licit to ignore the Vatican and just trust our bishop and priest to teach us on the Pope's behalf? No. 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 That would be against the profession of faith. For sure. Does the Catholic Church say that Muslims worship the same God as Christians? If it does, how can they be true? Can they be saved? Well, I explained it earlier, but so the first question I explained earlier, and the second one, if it does, how can they be true? I don't know what the second one means. The third one, can they be saved? This worship as Muslim worship is not salvific. It's something motivated through natural knowledge. It's something admixed with many sort of errors and superstitions. The claim is simply that the object of their worship is God as they know him from creatures, even while this worship is somehow defective, somehow wrong, false. So, yeah, that's the claim that's being made. We mean something very particular. First off, thank you for all your work. As an Eastern Orthodox looking into Catholicism, can you please help me understand Eastern Catholicism? How could they be in full communion? This has come up a lot in my journey. Okay, Eastern Catholicism, they are supposed to is the operative word. And for a lot of the people you're hearing about, they kind of are just spouting nonsense about Eastern Catholicism. If you just look at, there's a code of Eastern canon law. So you have various different churches in different liturgical traditions with different hierarchical structures. But when you look at Eastern Code of Canon Law, ultimately, their patriarchs, their whatever the heads of the Eastern churches are called, I can't remember what all the names are, but the heads of each one of these churches are in submission and communion with the Roman Pontiff. Submission both to governance and to teaching. Right? So if you read the Eastern Code of Canon Law, they have the same obligations towards ecumenical councils. They have the same obligations towards the judgments of the Curia. They have the same obligations towards all of the different loci of theology. So if there is a consensus of the fathers, if there's a consensus of the theologians, if there's a papal statement, if there's a statement which is made at a binding council, Eastern Catholics, just as much as Latin Catholics, are required to believe and profess these things. The profession of faith is something which is added into the canon law of both Eastern and Western Catholics, right? And you can look up the profession of faith if you want. You can look up the attached documents from the CDF and from St. John Paul II. They believe the same things as we believe. Now, there may be a distinction when it comes to 3 points. I mentioned 2 of them already. One of them when it comes to juridical structure. So when it comes to juridical structure, they have, their own priests and bishops and patriarchs, etc. They have their own hierarchy, which is in submission to the Roman Pontiff in a similar way, although slightly differently to how the Church of America has its own hierarchy, which is ultimately in submission to the Roman Pontiff. Again, functions slightly differently, but it's an analogy that can help you understand. Second point is liturgically. Their liturgy is done slightly differently. The Ruthenians do Ruthenian liturgy, the Melkites do Melkite liturgy, etc. And then third, as to theological tradition. And it's this third point that a lot of people will have errors on, because it may sound really weird, because earlier I said that there's a oneness of faith. There's a unity when it comes to everything to believe. If the Pope teaches something, it's as binding on Eastern Catholics as it is on Western Catholics, right? Even if, and this is what Eastern Code of Canon Law says, even if you have a universal law to the Latin Church, insofar as there is a principle of teaching contained in there, while the law itself is not binding on Eastern Catholics, the principle of teaching is binding on Eastern Catholics, right? So how can this be the case that they have an independent theological tradition? Well, what is meant by that is something quite distinct. It doesn't mean that they believe different things, of course. Rather, it means that the various different methods of theology that they may follow, the various modes of explanation, the various ways in which they order their teaching, and the various different authors that they frequently cite are going to be slightly different. Okay, and I mean, there's even that's even the case throughout the Western Catholic Church too. I mean, that's the case. Theology is done slightly differently in the 13th century than it is the 17th century. It's slightly differently done in the Dominicans rather than the Franciscans. It's slightly differently done in Spain than it is in the UK, than it is in Germany, than it is in Italy. There's slightly different variants to mode of theology, even while there's unity of faith. So, yeah, Eastern Catholicism, a lot of the stuff you hear online is literally just made up. These people are just making stuff up. They're not reading any documents of the church, going over Eastern Catholicism that are actually teaching what it is and then what they're supposed to do. And then considering any sort of violations from Eastern Catholics who are violating what the church teaches, what they're supposed to do, right? They're considering that as some sort of essential component, as if we could, for example, judge the beliefs of Latin Catholics based on, what James Martin professes or something like that. Ruben, thank you for the super chat. Appreciate it. Oh, snap, I did this wrong. Yeah, you did. Okay, Wagner, if a doctrine develops over time, does it make it false? A Protestant apologist said that in his articles. Can you explain? He gave the Immaculate Conception and papal supremacy as examples. Okay. There's two senses in which doctrinal development is used. Actually, there's three senses in which it can be used, but only two senses are correct. The first sense is the type of evolutionism which is transformistic. The transformistic evolutionism is kind of like the meme normie idea of how Darwinism works. So you have a monkey, and then this monkey evolves into a man, completely distinct species, right? Then there's a second type of development. And the second type of development, rather than changing into something different, merely brings out what is implied, what is already contained, right? So if I say Socrates is a man, since all men are rational, it would conclude that Socrates is rational, right? So that's the second type of doctrinal development. So let's say we have it dogmatically defined that Christ has a human nature. Since a human will is a part of human nature, it would we could conclude from this immediately that Christ had a human will. And then there is a third type of doctrinal development. And rather than drawing out what is virtually contained, we are simply explaining what is already taught. So, for example, we have the statement, the Word was made flesh, and this statement, the Word is made flesh, is explained by flesh, meaning, was made flesh means, assumed a human nature, right? So we can have the latter two types, because if you're just explaining what is already contained as drawing forth a new conclusion, which is virtually contained in the premises, or if you're just simply explaining the ideas to clarify them, those are lawful forms of doctrinal development. And even the church fathers talk about this type of doctrinal development. For example, St. Vincent of Lorraine, Origen, Origen's not a church father, but he's an early ecclesiastical writer, St. Augustine of Hippo, among many other authors. Okay, the first type of doctrinal development, transformistic evolutionism, this obviously requires a change into something which was not contained beforehand. So if we were to say, oh yeah, we believe in doctrinal development, we believe that the Immaculate Conception and papal supremacy were not taught in the apostolic deposit. Now we believe it. Well, that would be an example of the first type of doctrinal development, and that would completely make Catholicism false. It's absurd. It's the teaching of the modernists, which is opposed by St. Pius X, among others. But the latter two has always been taught. Okay. Oh yes, Reuben, Father Jason. Yes. Do you have the okay, good. You're planning on launching the fundraiser this week or the next. Okay, let me know right when that happens, and I will begin talking about that as a form of almsgiving that we can do during the season of Lent. How do Catholics view Jean Hus as a heretic? In connection to my last super chat, my friend said by ignore he meant not actively seeking out papal news and documents as opposed to dissent. Yeah, sure. You could do that. I mean, if reading whatever Pope Francis says in his homily every single day is going to cause confusion because you're not disposed towards reading him in light of his other works, or maybe you just are, have some other ill disposition, then sure. Like you're not like obliged by law to read through whatever Pope Francis says, which we should be, which would be really funny. Okay. SCOTUS is based. Let me see. Interesting profile picture. Very interesting. Wagner, can it be said that certain Anglicans, through Old Catholics and Swedish Lutherans, can have valid or is that violating apostolic cure? Yes, you can say that. So if I were you, I would read the there's a USCCB document on this. Basically, the judgment of apostolic cure is that a certain strain or line of Anglicans are invalid through various different arguments. But the whole idea is that this is invalid. But let's say you got all of these guys and they submitted to Rome, and then the Pope ordered all of them to be validly ordained and to, receive the sacrament of orders, right? In this case, we would obviously say, all these people have valid orders. So clearly, the situation can change after the time of the document to where we could still hold to the original judgment of the document being true during that time or for those individuals or for these circumstances, but saying in a different case or different circumstances, we say that it's actually different. Okay. Well, hour and a half. I usually only go an hour. And yeah, I kind of want to go. I kind of want to play some COD tonight. So anyways, I will talk to you guys all later. Do penance, for the kingdom of God is at hand. And as always, God bless.
Pope Benedict XVI said that mental prayer is an ordinary means that enables the disciple of Jesus to live in intimacy with the divine teacher. Yet, how does one engage in mental prayer? One of the greatest masters of the spiritual life was Saint Ignatius of Loyola. In the 19th century, a certain Jesuit priest decided to write a complete guide to mental prayer, patterned on the works of Saint Ignatius. Check out this work on Amazon, completely typeset, under the title, A Brief Guide to Mental Prayer According to the Mind of Saint Ignatius.